first impression you gave me.
Mhm.
I have a niece named Lorelei,
Mhm.
and she is the zaniest, most charismatic, sharp as a tack. She's one of those kids, like once a week, she just surprises everybody with something new, some sort of new way of dancing or yelling something or sharing something. And you weren't dancing or nothing, but you just reminded me of her a little bit. So,
Right. Well, I'm a dancer on the side, so.
oh yeah,
I do ballroom dancing.
no way.
Yeah,
What-
way.
Is that so I've done the foxtrot before.
Uh-huh.
So like what type of dances are under ballroom?
Yeah, so I actually do all four styles, or I have. There's two international styles, two American styles. International styles, there's international ballroom, which is your waltz, your tango, your foxtrot, your quick step, and what am I missing? Waltz, tango, quick step.
Not swing, because like
No,
swing.
no. And then anyway, for some reason I'm blanking at the moment. And then no, it's foreign international. And then in what we call international Latin, there's rumba, cha-cha, jive, paso doble, and what am I missing there? Jive, paso
I
doble,
can't even keep score because I
cha-cha,
don't know.
rumba, and anyway,
So
and then there's an American side where you have American waltz, American tango, American, all of those, and American, what you call rhythm. So you have the cha-cha, the rumba, the blah, 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 and bolero and mambo and those dances.
gotcha. So do you go to like a club, like a studio that does open nights weekly, or is like how does it?
Yeah, so I go to a studio
Yeah.
and work with an instructor. And so we do pro-am competitions. So
Oh,
yeah,
awesome.
so I'm not so much a social dancer anymore as much as I'm a competitive dancer.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I was kidding about Lorelei and her dancing.
I actually do. I
That's
compete.
awesome.
Yeah.
Are there it's interesting. There's some, my daughter started doing fencing, and it's a sport that not a lot of schools have. So it's a big club environment, and you can sign up to do different competitions, probably similar to, weightlifting or beauty pageants or dancing, it sounds like. So are there like open invitational things you can go to, or
Yeah, you can pretty much go to most anything as long as you're willing, as long as they have the classifications for
sure
that are appropriate for you. At the amateur level, there's different age ranges, there's different proficiency levels, things like that.
Sure.
And as long as you're willing to pay.
Yep.
Got to pay.
Yep. Yep. So do you take a partner, or?
I do pro-am. So I go with my professional instructor.
Nice.
And we compete against others who are also a professional dancer with an amateur.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
What's that?
I never knew that's what pro-am stood for. I remember watching, Happy Gilmore growing up, and there's a pro-am golf. Like I never knew, it never dawned on me that pro-am meant professional amateur.
Yep.
I feel there's something new today,
Yeah. So on Happy Gilmore, it was Bob Barker with him.
That's
I
right.
remember.
Oh
I remember
God.
well. And he would have been the professional, and Bob Barker would have been the amateur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to impersonate Adam Sandler right now, but I can definitely hear him saying, "Come on, Bob." That's so good. Well, my wife and I have done probably once a year, once every couple of years, we get roped into some sort of dance party of some sort that is formal, or a wedding or whatever. Go to training, and I can never keep them all straight. There's just too many. They'll typically learn 2 or 3 dances in the night, and I get confused. So I'm sure it comes with practice. Like anything.
Yeah. And honestly, when I hear music now, most of the time, instantaneously, I go to what thing I can dance to it.
Sure.
Based on timing and rhythm and tempo and that kind of thing.
Does it help you dance by yourself? Because I'm not a very good dancer by myself either. Like, I'd be curious.
I think dancing by yourself, because ballroom is such a partner-oriented event, that the only time it really is helpful to dance by yourself is when you're learning your choreography, or if part of your choreography in the American style, particularly, you're separated from your partner. It helps you to work on your moves. But a lot of times, even when you're dancing separately from your partner, you like to have them there, especially because you're the follower, not the leader. You kind of need to keep an eye on each other.
Sure.
So if he ends up doing something not expected, that you can adapt accordingly.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It sounds like a a hilarious Seinfeld episode to like imagine a ballroom dancer, professional, pro-am, you know, like
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
but they can't dance by themselves. Could you imagine?
Yeah.
That probably exists, but
Yeah.
I would imagine most people that are professional dancers with a partner are probably good
Yeah.
dancers.
Well, the harder part for the pros is in international ballroom, which is your waltzes and your tangos section, you're not allowed to separate from your partner.
Okay.
That's the one style where you're not allowed to separate. So what happens is that's actually the one that they hate the most in terms of if their partner's bad, because their partners will hang on them and it will hurt their arms.
Oh, geez.
And they'll get really exhausted over time. So if they're working with an amateur and the amateur doesn't know how to hold their frame and their own weight,
Totally.
then they have to dance around the floor with somebody weighing them down.
Yeah, that's not
So
efficient with
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody's separate, if they screw up, they've just screwed themselves up, and the judges and whatever, you know, like that's not their problem.
Yeah.
But if they're connected to them and they're messing up or they're doing whatever, they have to constantly correct. But more importantly, they can correct easily. It's the weight that makes it tough.
Yeah. Well, I had no inclination that we would kick off our talk at the American Nuclear Society meeting about dancing. This is great.
Surprise.
Yeah. So, people that might be watching don't know where we're at. We're an expo center. That's why there's, you know, a hotel door behind me and whatnot. But love to understand your perspective on the nuclear industry and all these things. So like, first, I'd love, maybe let's start with your career. You know, like how did you get here? You know, where'd you go to school? Where'd you come from?
Right.
You know,
right.
When'd you start dancing?
Yeah, here we go. The important things in life. So I actually got my undergraduate and graduate degrees in areas that have nothing to do with what I work in now, which is what happens with most typical HR and workforce people.
Yeah.
So I started I got my undergraduate degree, international studies from Kenyon College in Ohio. And I was a specialist in Latin America. And then I moved on to get my MBA in international business from the George Washington University. And what I tried to do when I was getting my graduate degree is I try to get through my classes as quickly as possible. So I stack them hard. Because I finished early, I was number one, exhausted. But number two, didn't really have time to look for jobs. So when I first got out of my graduate program, I started doing temporary work.
Yep.
And so I was going to all these different places, and I ended up in a company called PHP Healthcare Corporation in the HR department. And I was just doing file clerk stuff and all that while I was looking for a real job. And one day they came to me and they said, we want to hire you. I said, I don't think that's a good idea. This isn't what I want to do with my life. And I'm looking for a job. And they're like, that's okay. You can come in, work with us. And if and when you find a job, you know, feel free to move on. The sneakiest thing that I've ever encountered in my life, because they knew. They pulled me in, I got the job, and then they immediately started training me and sending me to classes and doing things to get me to understand their environment and what was going on, and trying to get me interested really in HR. And I was overall interested, but I didn't have the depth or breadth of experience to really understand what was going on and what higher level HR was. And so they were more than willing to put the resources in to get me trained. So for my first job was as an HR assistant with a healthcare company. And we were a federal contractor and a contractor for commercial entities as well. So we were a multi-state group. So 30 something states. And so a lot of the groups I dealt with were all over the country. Over time, I then was promoted into kind of the team lead for that. Then I took over an HR generalist role. I was moved out to one of the contract environments. And here's an interesting place that you would probably not imagine that I would have worked. But one of our contracts was at the Baltimore Correctional Facility Complex doing the healthcare. So I actually worked at the Baltimore complex, overseeing the healthcare contract from an HR perspective for several years.
Nice.
So I got to see the inmates and deal with the security and do all of that on a day-to-day basis. Eventually, our contract was assumed by another contractor. And so I very quickly moved over to the new contractor, but at the same time, people knowing that I was available. People I'd worked with at PHP went out and did their own company, and they called and they said, Lori, we need a new HR person. We need an HR person to be our corporate director. Can you come over and do that? And I said, okay, sure. Let's give it a shot. And it was a very small company at the time because they really had only acquired part of one company. And then it was my responsibility, along with everybody else, to grow the company. So over the next few years, we went from about 200 people to, I want to say, 1,000 people or so. And I built the entire infrastructure of the HR group. So that's really where I learned the nuts and bolts.
Sure.
And that's really where I was able to use a lot more of my skills that I had used in my previous company in terms of the employee relations stuff that I had to do and all of that. So moved on, did that for a while. Did healthcare for any number of years.
Yeah.
Finally, I kind of burned out on healthcare. So I looked for another industry. Healthcare is very demanding. It takes a lot of, especially in the federal contracting space and generalized contracting space, you're always bringing on contracts. Contracts are going, so you're always traveling, hiring people, laying people off.
Yeah.
Plus, you're doing the overall. So I moved into what I thought was going to be an easier industry, which was hospitality. So I became the corporate director of HR for a company that oversaw hotels, a variety of hotels. So again, I stayed traveling, and I spent the next 7, 8 years or so with them. That's when we hit the height of where the assets, selling real estate assets, people were paying out the yin yang for real estate assets. So my company started selling off all the hotels, and I was just like, we're kind of left with like the ones that are less profitable.
Sure.
You know, HR is going to be hit pretty soon. So I moved on. I took a little bit of time off. I moved on to another company, was there, but I ended up taking some time off because of a family responsibility.
Yeah.
My father got very ill, needed a double lung transplant. Took some time off to deal with that. And then when I came back into energy at the Nuclear Energy Institute.
Nice.
And from there, you know, over time, my portfolio at NEI expanded because, especially in healthcare, I had done a lot of workforce development work. In terms of regional and local, the establishment of regional and local, I'm going to say relationships, you know, developing those connections.
Yeah. Ecosystem building.
Exactly. The system building is a great way to say it. They really wanted me to take that over at NEI. So I did that.
Yeah.
And hence here I am.
Yeah.
Let's see, I started in NEI in 2012.
Yeah.
So here I am in 2025,
Yeah.
still happily with NEI. And I've took on learning the industry and building up. And my overall portfolio at NEI at this point is human resources, internal workforce development, and industry workforce development.
Yeah.
So I oversee all three of those areas.
And I met you primarily in the external facing world,
Correct.
right? With you were preparing people for this conference.
That's correct.
But yeah, I figured with your role that you had internal responsibilities.
Correct.
And how large is the NEI and what do they do?
NEI is very small. NEI is a trade association representing the interest of the nuclear energy industry. So we have people all along the chain from front end to fuel all the way through suppliers to utilities to back end support groups to decommissioning groups, etc.
Yep.
So we represent all of it, and we also represent academia as well. We have them as members. So we are only about 105 people at NEI, but our overall role for the industry is to make sure that we are, number one, lobbying and advocating on behalf of the industry for their interest. Number two, we interface with groups like NRC, DOE, FERC, et cetera, on issues that are related to our industry, particularly from a regulatory standpoint. So I have an entire group of engineers who spend their time dealing with the very technical operational issues and the upcoming regulatory issues for the industry. We also do things like communications and all of that.
And there's a lot of former military folks in the nuclear industry, I've noticed.
Yes,
and,
there is.
Yes,
there is.
Both military folks and nuclear folks tend to like acronyms. So NRC's the
Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Yep. And DOE
is the Department of Energy.
Yep. So those are the two main regulating bodies, right? For, power producing nuke sites, and then DOE is for the DOE labs, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, exactly. Great. Exactly. Yes. Those are the two, I would say, most impactful government agencies to what it is that we do. Yes.
I've been a little overwhelmed with I've my career, I've had a lot of interface with EPRI,
Mhm.
which is a great organization.
Yeah.
But yeah, trying to understand the difference between NEI sounds like really a trade organization,
Mhm.
like lobbying, you said first, and
Mhm.
what ecosystem building.
Mhm.
How is that different from American Nuclear Society?
Right.
And then I believe INPO
Uh-huh.
I think I know what that is, but could you
Right.
unpack those as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all have kind of our own swim lanes. We all work very closely together. We collaborate on so many things, but we have kind of our own individual niches. So the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations was established years ago. And really the point of them is they are the group that helps our utilities and our power plants with making sure they're ready for NRC inspections. And so they do inspections. They're really kind of the people that our industry looks to be the group that is the guru of the day-to-day operations.
Gotcha.
And making sure that everything is run safe and reliably.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are of course invested in all of that as well.
Yeah.
But we tend to deal with it more from if there's a new regulatory issue, or if there's a question about an existing regulatory issue, we're there to interface with the NRC to make sure that the interests of the industry are appropriately managed.
Yeah.
Once something's
events.
in place and the guidance is out there and everybody understands what's going on, then INPO is really just making sure that the sites are doing what is supposed to be done.
Gotcha.
So that's their primary thing. Of course, they do more.
They don't do the audits, right? NRC does audits and inspections.
No, they do them as well.
Okay.
To try to help prep them for the NRC. And because of some other things that they do. So yes, they go out. They try to how do I put this? They try to remain to some degree both an advocate for the industry, but also to some degree a little bit separated so that they can be objective as they're visiting the sites.
Yeah.
So they can give them realistic and appropriate feedback so that the sites can correct what it is that they're seeing so that they can be appropriately prepared.
Yeah. I really enjoyed Amanda's talk this morning. She's
Yes.
SVP of Learning and Development to some extent for INPO.
Teaching and learning. Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
So that was probably the best overview I had heard. Is INPO a government group or is it's a nonprofit or
it's a nonprofit group. Those who are in the power industry that are nuclear are required to be a member of INPO because of how their structure aligns with the NRC.
Gotcha.
So as an example, from a workforce perspective, there's something called an ACAD. An ACAD is really just, and don't ask me to remember what exactly it stands for.
Sure.
Everybody just calls it the ACAD. Yeah. It's the kind of framework for understanding what's required from a personnel perspective. So they monitor what's going on in the industry against the ACAD. So when, for example, we were setting up the nuclear uniform curriculum program many, many years ago, we needed to make sure that it was appropriate given what was established in the ACAD. We're currently right now updating the NUCP program. So we had to update the ACAD and get that approved and make sure it was appropriate and compliant.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
The gentleman who spoke yesterday, the chief nuclear officer for NAS
and NEI.
NEI. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is all reminding me of his talk. He mentioned something like the CEO had a saying or had a statement that this is the best run industry.
It is.
I mean, and obviously for good reason, right? So I've never heard of a government regulator requiring companies to be a part of an association like INPO.
Right.
I've never heard of that anywhere else.
Yeah. It's just kind of how it developed.
Sure.
Because of, and really it goes back to when, and I'm not an expert in this area, but it goes back to when TMI happened and there was a way that we kind of self-governed ourselves.
Totally.
And that's what we do in nuclear. We self-govern. So we put this structure together to try to make it easier to make sure that we're collaborating with each other, that we have that oversight, that we're doing what the NRC needs to do. We kind of did it to ourselves and developed that structure.
You know, somebody gave me the book, The Rickover Effect.
Yes.
Admiral Rickover. And yeah, I mean, after World War II, we had to figure out how to put nuclear propulsion systems in our fleet and our naval vessels. And had to figure out how to keep our sailors safe, right? So
Right.
like it was a
Mhm.
incredible development, and so many former Navy veterans in this industry, which is great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
overall, I mean, I don't recall any of the statistics, but ultimately nuclear has delivered a lot. I thought it delivered more electricity safely than other forms. I guess is one of
The issue really comes down to what we call capacity factors. And I'm just going to simplify that by saying that we so efficiently run our fleet that the amount that we generate versus, as you look at it overall, it's just that capacity factor is so high that we kind of outshine other energy sources when you look at that capacity factor. And so when you're looking at that we're efficient, that's really what they're talking about.
Yeah. Doesn't nuclear provide, is it 20 to 30% of our base load?
I think it's about 20%.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly growing. It sounds like the numbers I heard yesterday, roughly a dozen new plants planned and 3 more restarts. And I don't know if I know that you're not in the,
That's okay.
This is all hard to keep track of, but like it sounds like the nuclear industry is trying to grow its capacity by 20 to 30% over the next 10 years or so.
Right. Well, when we're talking about capacity, we're talking about the capacity factors of an individual reactor. Having said that, what you're referencing is there are a few trends going on that we see in nuclear that we think will help us, being nuclear, be a big part of the energy portfolio in the future. The first is, yes, we are recommissioning at least 2, 3 decommissioning plants, decommissioned plants. So that's exciting, with the possibility of this third one that we were talking about yesterday. So that's all good news. But essentially what the story is this. Between now and 2050, there is a certain amount of projected energy demand. And that energy demand is escalating at a rate that we haven't seen historically because of things like data centers, which consume huge amounts of energy. So as people are looking at that, they're going, okay, we need to figure out how we're going to get that demand met, right? And you can look at different types of power generating sources. And what some of the advantages of nuclear are that they can run 24/7. So in some cases, if you have, certain extenuating circumstances for certain other power sources, and I'm not going to go in. I don't want to make it sound like, okay. There can be certain things that
sun, we can't make electricity, right?
I wasn't going to say it, but thank you for saying it. And certain other things. So, number one, we have the ability to run 24/7. Number two, we're base load capable. And that's what you're talking about when you don't have wind or solar. A lot of times those wind and solar farms have to have a backup combined gas facility or some other type of thing to make sure that they can supply the energy that they're promising to the grid. The grid is very interesting because I'm sure you know about all the different markets across the country and how energy is kind of bought and purchased. And there's certain regulated ones, certain unregulated ones. But essentially people in many of the unregulated markets are basically saying, we're going to supply you this much energy. And for that, they're going to get such and such a price. So if you have to be careful that you have to be able to meet that.
That's a contractual obligation.
It's kind of a contractual obligation. Having said that, there has been the case where they have not. In which case they get certain penalties and things like that. But the worst part of that is that people just don't have the electricity they need. And this is what happens when you have the major issues, when you have a huge storm that knocks things out for a period of time, or the energy is disrupted for some reason. And that's the thing about our first world living is that we're reliant on energy. And if you have something that impacts that is really a huge issue. So we're safe, we're reliable, we can do baseload capacities. We've got a lot of those unique qualifiers that some of the other power generating sources do not have to the same degree.
Yeah, and does baseload mean then the definition mean that there doesn't need to be a backup plan?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, a solar plant can't be considered base load because it has a cogen plant on site or something, or
Right. It by itself cannot generate the amount of required electricity as needed and on demand.
yeah. Curious. I really don't know much about you said regulated versus unregulated electricity. I mean, and there's different anecdotes that come to mind. Like it was a few years ago, Texas got an independent grid. I just moved to Texas, from Washington, and the state of Texas was, I don't know how much of the state was out for a day or two, right? Big deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got really familiar with like BPA back in the Pacific Northwest, Bonneville Power Administration. And they kind of manage a lot of the dams, hydropower,
Right.
WAPA in the Midwest, and TVA and so on. But yeah, I'd be curious if you could break down regulated versus un.
Yeah. So a regulated market means that a group of commission kind of comes in and determines what the rates are going to be. So there's not a lot of bidding involved, whereas in an unregulated market, there's bidding involved in being able to supply the electricity. So you have to go in with kind of an offer, and then they look at all the offers. And so that was one of the ways that that nuclear was in some ways disadvantaged for a period of time, and why some of the tax credits that we received were so important, because people are able to come in with lower prices, but they don't necessarily have those same attributes that we were talking about, being in terms of safe, reliable, baseload capable, etc. So our thing has been for several years, and I think this was ultimately heard, and that's one of the reasons why there's certain state tax credits, federal tax credits, etc., is all of those attributes combined bring a value that equates to something beyond what is actually being the money piece of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Intangible value.
The intangible, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
The intangible value that those things bring. If your gas line breaks and you don't have gas to supply your electricity, there's an intangible cost there.
Totally.
If your wind doesn't turn the turbine,
Yep.
creating the electricity, there's a
Sure.
intangible cost there. So we've been trying really hard to get people to understand those positive attributes of nuclear that were kind of overlooked for a lot of years, including the fact that we're baseload capable, but also a clean energy source. And so those are two very powerful attributes that we've been trying to get people to notice for quite a while. And now they are. And so as we look at this great energy demand that I was talking about earlier, people are saying and really starting to see all of those attributes, and they're going, nuclear needs to be a part of this, of the energy that is supplying the energy in the US. The issue with that is that the light water reactors that we currently have in the operating fleet, they are built to last, and they're built to last for a very long time, right? That makes them very expensive up front.
Sure.
And we haven't constructed them until just recently at Vogtle in a lot of years. So going back and building a nuclear plant for the first time, very expensive, because number one, we're not in a pattern that we were, 50 years ago, where we were putting so much of this up that we had all the infrastructure in place, and we had the practices in place that made things much more cost efficient. So now we have to get back to that place where we have to get beyond first of a kind cost, right? And people are scared of that. When they go, oh, it's kind of first of a kind cost, we don't know what we're getting ourselves into. And so people are a little afraid to invest. They want the nuclear, but they're a little bit afraid of the investment piece of it. So that's a part of what NEI is doing, and part of the conversations that we're having in investor world and amongst different groups, trying to go, it is first of a kind. There might be issues, but we are going to continue to become more and more efficient with economies of scale, and things are going to get better. And we need this nuclear to be a part of this energy portfolio in the US. It really needs to be there.
What's fascinating to me too about the industry is it's not like it doesn't seem like a very hyper competitive industry, meaning that it's not like, our company's going to be able to compete and go build a nuke plant right next to another one that right out the street.
Right.
So people seem to be very collaborative. And on that note, when it was Southern Company put in Plant Vogtle, right?
Mhm,
And I know
correct.
Bechtel finished the project after a lot of headaches. And I mean, does NEI ever capture like the commercial investment information and sort of share that and help the industry understand how can we lower these upfront costs, or how can we make this more efficient?
Yeah, absolutely. So the people who constructed it did a lot of that. But where we could, we provided our expertise and we provided our analysis to help with things, because we are invested in trying to make sure that future ones move forward. A lot of that analysis was done by the groups who did it.
Yeah.
And we rely on that information and data. But as you said, we're collaborative. We believe in the U.S. Nuclear industry that an incident in nuclear in any place is an incident for nuclear everywhere.
Yeah, totally.
So, if you have a Fukushima or you have a Chernobyl or you have whatever, that paints every nuclear as if it's the same thing, and it's really not. Chernobyl was a very unique set of circumstances that would never be allowed to happen in the U.S. The same with Fukushima.
Yeah.
That where they built, how they built it is not something that would happen in the U.S. So we tend to be very collaborative. We tend to share information. Sometimes it's not publicly available, but there tends to be a lot of sharing, because we want to make sure that we're operating the most safe fleet that we possibly can. And the way that we do that is sharing lessons learned among each other.
Yeah.
So nuclear is by far, of the career that I've had, the industry that focuses the most on lessons learned and making sure that you continuously improve.
Yeah.
And they share that data with each other, or they share that experience with each other.
Yeah. A story I heard on that, I think I mentioned to you before, ITI and Interplay Learning, we do a lot of training for the different utilities, mostly operations and maintenance staff.
Mhm.
I've heard that if there's a near miss even or something, there's a system internally at the plants, right? I don't know if it's through
Correct.
INPO or what, but like if there's a near miss or an oddball thing that happens at a Palisades, within minutes, it sort of hits the wires to all the other plants, right?
Yeah.
What is that?
Absolutely. Generally what you're speaking, I'm going to say what we call a scram.
Yeah.
And that means that we may have to power down for some unexpected reason.
Mm-hmm.
It happens occasionally. Not often, thankfully. But yeah, the minute that happens, there's interface with INPO, there's interface with the NRC, there's an immediate reporting mechanism to do that.
Yeah.
To make sure that everybody's aware if this is a safety significant issue, if it's not a safety significant issue, and usually it's not, but people need to know and be aware in case anything needs to be mobilized.
Yeah.
And so, we try to make sure the important thing is that if and when something happens, there might be, I don't know, a small leak of something, or there might be a small fire somewhere or something. If it's quickly contained, we can report that, it can get back through, and everybody can kind of find out what happened and then lessons learned. But the point that I guess that I would make is that we're not afraid of telling on ourselves.
Yeah.
We're not afraid of doing the right thing and notifying the right people. We're never trying to hide anything under the cover of darkness.
Yeah.
We're always trying to say, this is what happened. Now, what I will be candid and frank about is our first thing is we're not going to go to the media first and say, by the way, 5 minutes ago, we had a small fire, whatever. We're going to work it. We're going to see what happened. We're going to do our lessons learned. We're going to figure that out. And then, have that conversation, but our regulators will know immediately.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you said it really well, that an incident, it's like, I don't know a good metaphor, but the saying is an attack on one is an attack on all, but it's like, a black eye for one is a black eye for the whole industry, and nuclear's had such a uphill battle the past couple of decades, right? Probably mostly since the major meltdowns that have happened, and it's been interesting. So you mentioned TMI earlier, right? And so on, but the past 10 years, I don't know if you can point to PR actions or why the nuclear industry seems like it's done a really good job of gaining better publicity and maybe consumer acceptance. And then also more lately, you see Microsoft signing up a purchasing agreement with one of as a Constellation plant, right? And So you get tech companies that are very consumer facing.
Mhm.
That's good. Seems like, right?
Yes.
I mean, Amazon,
Yes.
et cetera, using
Yeah.
nuclear. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, was there, I'm sure you all have worked really hard at that
Yeah.
public image.
Yeah.
Was there a specific thing that
Yeah.
got you there?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what I would say is this, the big incident in the US history was TMI years ago. Understanding that there were actually no fatalities
Yeah.
and no actual incidents, but I mean, there was an incident, but there was no
It
fatalities
was a
or
big
anything that came
scare.
out. It was a big scare.
Yeah.
And we don't want that to ever happen again. That's when the industry banded together, and that's when we started this collaborative approach. And we are highly, highly safety focused in the U.S. And so that piece of it kind of takes care of itself. We have such an exceptional record of safety that it's easy for us when people go nuclear, Fukushima, Chernobyl, da 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 da. We're like, when's the last time you've heard of anything really related to nuclear in the United States?
My whole growing up, it was odd because it just wasn't
Yeah.
backed, but it wasn't backed by facts.
Yeah.
So I didn't quite know where it was coming from.
Yeah.
Remember in Washington State, I believe there was around the Portland metro area, probably 100, 200 miles. I can't recall where it was. Something Horse. Is this ringing a bell? That there was I thought a plant it got either application submitted or it was going to be under construction like in the 90s or something, and it got mothballed because a lot of people threw a fit about it.
Oh, yeah.
And
possible.
yeah, so it's just odd how it gained so much negative perception.
Yeah.
And
my personal opinion on that is that people conflate nuclear armaments with nuclear energy.
oh yeah, good point. Yeah.
They hear nuclear and they have this sense of, when the bombs were dropped in
Yeah.
Japan and the devastation and the so forth, so on that occurred. And then that doesn't help when you have a Chernobyl or Fukushima or that kind of thing. But if you look at the US, we don't really have fatalities in our industry.
Yeah.
There's actually been more fatalities in other industries, power generating sources than in ours. So I think that's the conflation. I think people hear nuclear and they automatically go to these awful images of nuclear bombs
that's
or
right.
nuclear armament.
Yeah.
And that's not what nuclear energy
Yeah,
is.
totally.
We're not for proliferation.
Sure.
We're not in the
It's
proliferation
something-
discussion.
yeah.
They're not the same thing.
Defense policy is a little
Yeah.
bit different.
So
Energy.
exactly. So, but people hear nuclear and
Yeah.
that's where their mind goes
That's a good
to.
point.
And so they automatically think that nuclear energy is like that.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. So, so having said that, we have this great safety record. And I think what we really started trying to do is having as many conversations with as many groups, we made a concerted effort to have the conversations we needed to have in as many spaces as we could to talk about two things, or talk about, actually, I'm going to say more than two things, several things. First is reminding people that we're clean. We're a clean source of energy. People keep forgetting about that. Number two, the reliability, safety, all of that stuff that we talked about before. But also that the number of high paying jobs that we have, talking about things like, I don't know, we're just bringing all those positive things about nuclear forward and having those conversations, reminding people that these are all the great things. And if you really look at the history of what's happened with nuclear energy in the United States, it's been great.
Yeah.
And more than that, one of the reasons that some people are so on board with advanced nuclear, even if they weren't on board with the existing nuclear fleet, is the advancements in the advanced reactors is they're run differently. They have a different structure behind their process so that they tend to be even more safe.
Yeah.
The mechanisms, the mechanical mechanisms are in place based on the fuel type or based on how things are managed within the reactor so that they're very, very safe. They don't have the same risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
So even people who are just kind of like, oh, I don't know about current, they're more on board with the advanced reactors because they have a different risk profile for the most part than what the current fleet do.
It's much less expensive.
It's less expensive. It's considered,
So
It's
maybe
smaller in people's mind. They perceive it as safer, and
yeah,
in many ways it is
yeah,
because of the protocols
sure.
that these reactors have in place. All of that I think has helped change the
Yeah,
conversation. But also there's just a natural piece of this that when you have seen disruptions to energy, where we've had some major energy disruptions,
yeah,
people start asking questions.
sure.
And when they start asking questions and realize that things are not quite what they thought that they were, then all of a sudden nuclear starts looking better.
That's right.
Yeah.
People don't pain uh pain pushes until desire pulls. Is that a saying?
Is that a saying?
I meant to remind said that once. I don't know if it makes sense here, but people have to feel pain
Right.
or, to really see a problem.
Right.
I was even thinking about my utility bill. I think people are generally ill-informed to where they get their electricity from. They certainly see the price point, here and there, but
Right.
Even growing up in Washington, I don't know if it'd been really smart if the utility would say, this is all coming from hydro.
Right. Right.
Maybe.
Right.
But,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's the populace needs more publicity, more intelligence around what nuclear is.
Yeah.
I'm sure you heard about that. There's a Bill Gates special on Netflix a few years ago called Inside Bill's Brain, and he highlighted, is it TerraPower? Maybe
It's yes.
And it was mind-boggling because they take spent fuel rods and they use them for a long time, apparently. And I heard it was a way similar to what you're describing. The structure of the reactor, it's inherently safe. It can't melt down.
That's exactly right.
So that sort of publicity is great. What's getting in the way? I mean, obviously that's a really new technology, it sounds like. And then, is it called SMRs?
Yeah, small modular reactors.
Yeah, yeah. So what's stopping? When's the first SMR going to be installed?
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't have a good answer on that because there's so many things that need to be dealt with to make sure that we can deploy. The first is, number one, we have to have the right regulatory structure in place. The regulatory structure we have in place really set up for a certain type of reactor type right now, right? It's a different risk profile that we're looking at when we're looking at these new reactors. And so, the argument from the advanced reactor developers is, why would we be regulated to this degree? We don't have these safety issues that the current fleet has. So all of that has to be worked out. So there's a regulatory thing. There's a regulatory piece. There's an investment piece. As I said before, while SMRs and things are cheaper, they're still investments. And they're first of a kind investments. So they're kind of like, well, it's untested technology, right? So people are kind of like, okay, well, you need me to put a lot of money and there's never been one of these before and you want me to invest in it. And
And who's making them? Does Westinghouse make any versions of this, or others like startups?
Yeah, there's different groups who have different versions of advanced reactors. I want to say there's probably 30 different advanced reactor groups with different technologies and things. Don't quote me on that. I'm sure my technical people can tell you, but it's a lot, and they all have different technical specifications. I think probably the one that most people are thinking about is probably the NuScale version, because that was the version of the small modular reactor. I think that was kind of first predominantly advertised. But really the idea behind a small modular reactor is that you can stand up a reactor and then you can build on it up to a number of other reactors to it to build up the number build up the amount of energy that you're supplying. So this is great in areas where perhaps you don't have a lot of population right now. So you can just buy the one, right? You can get that up and running. But then as your population grows, you can add a second, you can add a third, you can add a fourth up until you maximize out the design. So that's typically what you think of when you think of a small modular reactor. There are other types of reactors. There's micro reactors, which when you talk about, aligning things to universities and things like that, usually talking about the micro reactor space. But we have kind of different categories based on kind of the amount of electricity that can be generated. And so we have them from the very small micro reactors all the way up to our current light water reactor fleet that can generate quite a bit of gigawatts.
Nice. Yeah, a gentleman earlier was telling me about he believes there'll be a lot of reactors on campus, like manufacturing plants, petrochemical plants, and at some point it's just, cheaper for a manufacturer to put up the capital in a 2-year build out. And
that is how, Dow is thinking about it. Those companies who have announced plans and are partnering with various nuclear companies, that's their thought. Is it's just easier for us to get our own facility, maintain it over time, and we're going to actually end up ahead of things, in over a period of time.
And does the business model change for a Constellation Energy or Entergy, et cetera? Does the industry, do the players continue to own and manage the reactor, but maybe put it on premise?
I think that that's what's being worked out from a regulatory standpoint. When you deal with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you have to have somebody who's licensed.
Totally.
And who that licensee is going to be. So is there going to be a developer and then somebody who specializes in running it and being the licensee? That's all kind of being worked out based on
sense to me.
Based on how things are going to model. There's different models and ways of thinking about who the licensee should be. And that'll be worked out over time.
And who are the people doing that? So the NRC certainly is the regulatory side. Does NEI help coordinate executives from the different utilities to?
Yeah, absolutely. As things more firm up, we will 100% work with the interested parties, the stakeholders, and the NRC to make sure, but to encourage the right view or encourage the right approach to licensing. And some of that's about what the company itself wants to be involved in. It may say, look, I am good at manufacturing this, but I don't know anything about nuclear energy. So if there's somebody we can purchase it and then you run it on our behalf and you're the licensee, that might work for them. Whereas if others might say, you know what, we want to get in this business, we'll hire our own nuclear experts. We want to become the licensee, and we're going to have our own little subsidiary that does that. That's a possibility as well. So, I mean, it can be different. It can be done differently. And I think it's going to be on each kind of group and business to decide what it wants to do and how it wants to structure it. As long as in the end, you meet the regulatory guidelines that are needed to get that license, and that framework, as I said, is still being developed or is still being looked at or considered, then the licensee is licensed and they can proceed. You just have to make sure that whoever's running it can be licensed and can demonstrate the fact that they are doing the things that are necessary to be licensed.
Yeah, totally. The one I just read about today was a Microsoft one. I can't recall which plant was that at. Do you know?
I don't remember off the top of my head. There's so many of them
in Pennsylvania, and it was a purchase agreement, right? As opposed to obviously, my first question was, it's okay. Is Microsoft putting a data center there, and are they owning the restarted plant? I would not expect that. But when you talk about a net new reactor somewhere, and it's on Amazon's property,
Yes.
There's a question there. Do you get concerned at all that, I think there is a lot of pressure sounding, I mean, if you follow the tech community and obviously the new administration in Washington, DC, there seems to be a lot of pressure to get more electricity capacity as soon as possible.
Yes.
So do you have any concern that SMRs sort of get rushed through from a regulatory perspective, or do you feel like there's good guardrails in place?
I feel like it's the opposite in terms of we want to be able to move faster, I think, than what I think the regulatory framework is ready to do.
It's usually the case.
Yeah. So I think that if we could, we would push it faster. Having said that, we're still dealing with certain other factors to kind of get up and running, or not get up and running, identify those who really want to move forward outside of those things that have been publicly announced, which there's only been a few, public announcements about what's actually moving forward. And, in TerraPower, you talked about in Wyoming has gotten its construction permit and things like that. But there's not a lot of that out there right now. And unfortunately for now, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Project is, I believe, in pause for a short period of time while they look at all the stuff related to the transition of administration. So there's there needs to, some things have to settle themselves out.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And I guess it'll ultimately come down to, I mean, a company's gonna have to say, we're gonna invest in this.
That's exactly right.
And
And
it's
send the
not a
demand
committee
signal.
discussion. It's like,
Mhm.
eventually,
Yeah.
we're gonna put a new reactor here.
Yes.
And NRC help us get the regulatory thing figured out for this one, and they'll
Yes.
use that.
Yes.
And go for
And
it.
that's important because we need people to step up to say they're actually going to do it
Yeah,
and that they're going to finance it, because then that can help us trigger the supply chain and workforce stuff that we need to trigger
yeah,
to make sure that we're ready to meet the demands for those things.
yeah,
What we suspect will happen, although we don't know, is we think that there might be a hockey stick effect, meaning it's going to be really hard to get that first 1, 2, 3, 4 done. But then once it's done, everybody sees, at what cost you can do it, how effectively you can do it. They can see that things are getting more and more efficient. Then all of a sudden, everybody's going to want them.
yeah,
And so we're kind of like, we just don't win and where that hockey stick is going to happen, but that's what we think will happen.
yeah,
And then there'll be a lot of very fast growth and expansion.
yeah. You ever read Crossing the Chasm? That it's a marketing executive book, Crossing the Chasm.
Mhm.
It's the very simple kind of technology adoption curve, right? You've got
Right.
the very first people group is very small.
Mhm.
Less in fact, those are the innovators,
Right.
even the people that just want to tinker with a new technology.
Right. Right.
Then you think you got the early adopters,
Hmm.
and then you really have to cross the chasm to the early. I'm messing this up. I can't remember if it's early adopters, but anyways, there's these two first phases that are maybe 20% of the market.
Right.
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 You really got to get to that. I think it's more called the early adopters.
Yeah.
And then the late adopters come later, but
Yeah.
It takes a lot of effort and a lot of wins, and
Mhm.
certainly pioneers get the arrows. That's a
Mhm.
fun saying.
Right.
Of course, sad
Right.
saying.
Right.
But,
Right. Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
to some extent, but
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and it's a good segue into workforce
Mhm.
because I mean, so we already have the nuclear industry has a massive need already
Correct.
for work
Mhm.
operations, maintenance,
Mhm.
engineering, et cetera.
Mhm.
Just because of the silver wave retirement, right? That's what is that? I should find out if that's the appropriate thing to say. Is that what do you
Well,
think?
that's not exactly what we say, but
Yeah.
to no, we called it a retirement cliff. Now there's different.
In my defense, sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay.
It was oh my gosh, it was a labor economist guy that I've heard this from.
Okay.
So, but
Okay.
I probably shouldn't use that term if it's not appropriate.
Well, it's not what we say, but you're welcome to say whatever works for you. Yeah. So in the commercial sector, not to say that this is the same across all commercial entities, but most of our biggest retirement cliff that we were worried about was in that mid 2015, 2016, 2017. We, at that point, we were very worried. We worked a lot of years to work on knowledge transfer and retention and a lot of different programs to try to transition things. So we got mostly beyond that. Having said that,
what was causing that? I didn't realize that.
so it was the demographic shifts in our industry. So if you think of when a lot of our entities were built, and we had a lot of career long employees, that just happened to hit where kind of that 20 mid 10 to 20 range. And so we had a big retirement cliff at that point in time. Now, does that mean that we didn't still have people retiring after that? Of course, we still have people retiring after that. It tended to be in more specialized areas. But where there still exists an issue regarding retirement is that while that happened in the commercial fleet, a lot of other areas related to nuclear still hadn't hit their retirement cliffs. For example, in government, DOE, the labs, those kinds of positions. So they are still dealing with retirement cliff issues. And we look at this as an overall nuclear energy industry issue.
Sure.
Because we don't like to poach each other, try to steal each other. We want enough resources for everybody, right?
Yeah.
And so if the labs are having issues, that impacts our ability to manage what's going on in our industry effectively. So we care that they're affected by that.
And I assume there's pretty good retention in the industry compared to others because people do go through quite a bit of industry specific training, right?
So
do you find that or maybe not?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Historically, that was the case. Much like the rest of the US, when we hit the pandemic and we started seeing a creep up in our voluntary attrition right before the pandemic. We had the highest that we had seen to that date right before the pandemic. Historically, it was very low, 2-3%, something like that. We saw an uptick in that right before the pandemic. Everybody stayed put during the pandemic. Everybody was afraid to leave, go anywhere. They didn't know what was going to be happening. Right after the pandemic, we, along with the entire country, experienced massive attrition and turnover for our industries.
Migration, right?
There was exactly people, they were calling it the quitter's market at that time.
Yeah.
Because everybody who had pent up from 2 years of being what they felt like stuck in a place and whatever.
Yeah.
And then those certain people were leaving to pursue remote opportunities because they got used to a remote environment. And if their company wanted them back, they don't want to go back. And there was just a number of things going on. We, of course, experienced increased attrition at that point in time. Now, was it to the same degree as certain other industries? No. But was it significant for us? Yes, because from a recruiting standpoint, that's not what we were used to. We weren't used to recruiting at that level. So we had to ramp up all of our HR stuff. So not only were we dealing with all the return to work issues, but from HR perspective, we're dealing with recruiting like we hadn't seen it in forever, right? So for us, it was a very difficult time as an industry. That has since stabilized, but it's more stable across the US in general. But there was a year or two where it was kind of like, oh my gosh, there's just so much going on. Now where we are in terms of that is we have certain areas where we tend to have more retirement, but at the same time, we have more voluntary attrition. So we have overall a decent amount of attrition from the industry compared to what we had prior. Now, the area that we're most keeping our eye on these days is in radiation protection and health physics. They were behind the curve of everybody else, and they've caught up, and now they're going over that retirement cliff in the commercial industry and in other parts of the nuclear sector as well. So we've got that. We now see the curve kind of happening with engineers. So they're starting to move right a little bit. So we need to keep our eye on that. So we do have some areas, we constantly keep an eye on our demographics, and we try to make sure that we adjust our strategies and approaches appropriately. So we have a lot of work going on right now in trying to make sure that we're shoring up the radiation protection and health physics pipelines.
Gotcha.
And so, yeah.
I didn't realize radiation protection was a job on its own. I thought it was a competency, but is it a monitoring job and inspection?
Yeah, there's different things that you do with radiation protection, but yeah, for the most part, it's a, you might have a radiation protection technician who may go and help and make sure, to take readings here and there and things like that to make sure that nothing is throwing off radiation that shouldn't be throwing off radiation, or checking something for radiation or whatever the case may be. We have outages, of course, in our industry. These only occur for a plant every 18 to 24 months. A planned outage. Yes. That's exactly right.
Yep.
And during that, of course, because you're removing fuel and you're getting it into the fuel spent pools and things like that, there's a lot of radiation stuff that goes on then. So a lot of our suppliers who deal with the outage personnel, we, number one, need more outage personnel. That's another issue. Yeah. But number two, that tends to be a huge number of radiation protection people, whether they're technicians or at a higher level. So there's those types, but you do have your normal kind of monitoring people that are there, but you also have these others that tend to be related to decommissioning, because when you're decommissioning something, you need to make sure you're doing it in a very safe way, that you're not throwing off any radiation issues, things like that. So they tend to be very involved in that. They tend to be very involved in outages, and they tend to have kind of an operations and management piece as well. So those are the types of things they tend to do.
Sure. Almost sounds, construction industry sounds similar to like a safety, monitor to some extent, but obviously looking out, they're especially trained in radiation detection and.
Right. And making sure that things are done in a safe way so that no radiation is thrown off. Right.
Yeah.
So they're going to keep their eye as you're transitioning things from the core into the pool.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that's done in a very specific way. And there's a lot of people involved in that. And the radiation protection people are going to be keeping their eyes on all the things that they need to be keeping their eyes on to make sure that that radiation isn't, that nothing is happening with that radiation in that process.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting with you to unpack, sometimes there's a big macro issue I'd like to discuss, like just around talent awareness, because I'd be super curious on your thoughts on that. It's easy to talk macro level on other topics too, like we've got a labor shortage and it's 30% of the industry might be skilled trades and 15% engineering or whatever.
Right.
It doesn't hit home to people very well, right?
Right.
I'm curious around, obviously we're going to be dealing with a shortage, seems like for a long time. In nuclear industry, do you think there's opportunity for roles that were historically different to have more combined roles? So for example, could and would you cross train maintenance techs to also be your radiation people, but obviously you're managing.
Yeah.
Are we applying the right amount of?
Yes.
So do you see that happen? And I'm curious if you even, I'm not sure there's a workforce development term for that. What is that practice called?
Cross training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay.
Yeah. Actually, that is one of the conversations.
Thank you for the most obvious answer ever.
It's okay.
I feel stupid now.
No, it's called cross training. That's what we call it.
Yeah.
But having said that, that is part of the discussion happening right now, is we're trying to figure out how things are going to be staffed in the future and where and how. So the advanced reactors, as an example, have a very different operational approach. They're not going to need as many people. They're going to be smaller. And they're going to have a different set of skills. Right now, as an example, if you look in an operating room, one of our plants, for the most part, it's going to be analog. We do have some digital INC out there, but all of our new plants are going to only have digital INC.
INC is
instrumentation and control.
I knew the first part of that. I'm catching on.
Good for you. Yeah, I have to stop talking in acronyms.
No, it's good. I'll help make sure you pull it out of you.
I appreciate that because I will completely forget. So somebody
analog machines.
Yeah, we have a lot of analog in our existing fleet. We're hoping to get more to go to digital INC. Having said that, in the advanced reactors, because of how they can operate and how they're managed and how they need to be run, there is a possibility that you could take 2 or 3 of the old positions at a light water reactor and combine those into one.
Sure.
So that's an example of a conversation that is currently happening, because we do need to think about the skills and qualifications necessary for future positions very differently than how we're thinking about them now.
Yeah.
We also need to think about now how we can change our approach to reskilling, upskilling people so that we can get people in. As we have to compete for more scarcity of labor, we have to figure out the way to get people in the door appropriately trained and or get them in the door and grow them ourselves.
Yeah.
And so what are those skills and talents that we absolutely at a minimum need? And then how do we micro train, or how do we do some blended training after they get in? How do we grow them here? And one of the things that we know is people want to have the ability to constantly grow in their career. And that's great. So how do we take advantage of that? Now, having said that, we have to make sure that we're meeting the appropriate ACADS, that there's a certain level of proficiency and that there's a certain skill being demonstrated, because that's part of what we're required to do.
Let's double click on that real quick. So does ACAD publish a list of occupations currently or skills?
No, the ACAD is that regulatory framework I was talking to you about.
Yeah.
And so the ACAD is a document that kind of talks about kind of the skills and qualifications necessary for different types of positions.
Okay. So, but it is explicit around, is there a list of positions in that framework? Or is it more about how to build an occupation with skills?
It's kind of a combination of both, I would say. I'm not an ACAD expert, but what I would say is that it says kind of like these types of positions need these types of skills and qualifications because of these reasonings, and they have to be able to demonstrate it and be proficient in it.
Yep. So a maintenance role, they need to understand basic nuclear, this and that, and basic radiation, self-preservation, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Because I want to understand that against the STE program, which is from EPRI, I believe. So that's the standardized task evaluation.
Correct.
And that seems very explicit. Like it's, this is, you know, the test for the overhead crane operator or something, you know, so that, do you know, how many STEs are there? Just ball, like order magnitude, are there 500? Are there 1,000?
I haven't paid attention to the number. I've got to be honest with you.
It's not in EPRI does because they publish content and then testing content.
Yeah, they do. To go back to your original question, by the way, I never finished explaining the difference between ANS and INPO and so forth, so on.
I have ANS circled still.
Yeah, so EPRI is the Electric Power Research Institute. So they actually deal with more than just nuclear, of course.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the name says that they do a lot of research. So when we need a very technical analysis of something, like say we're dealing with a material safety issue, we might go to EPRI and say, can you look at this? Because they have the wherewithal and the capabilities to do that in-depth structural analysis that we might need. Yeah. So they're very good from that perspective. They are also very good with dealing with the training side of things. My counterparts kind of over at EPRI, who I deal with quite a bit, they are highly proficient in developing curricula that are appropriate. They understand kind of the environment in which we work and kind of what's necessary to be included in a training program. So as an example, they started setting up kind of this common training a while back. For example, there was one for, I think they were setting up one for radiation. There was one before that, radiation protection, et cetera. That tends to be where their strength lies. They tend to be able to do a lot of that qualitative analysis, and they're very good at structuralizing things. Yeah. So that's kind of their
a membership organization, right? So again, a lot of the power stations or electric power producers are members, and they're a nonprofit. Yeah.
That's correct. Exactly right. Exactly right. The American Nuclear Society is, as Craig said during his speech yesterday, Craig Piercy, the executive director and CEO, they are the entryway into nuclear. So they're very much about the students, how do you get into nuclear, kind of bridging people into it. So ANS is very good with things like we worked with them some years ago for the Navigating Nuclear curriculum, which is a K-12 program that provides basic curriculum that can go into school through the Discovery Network, Discovery Education Network, which is in most of the K-12 programs. People have access to that, but we made it free. Nice. So we basically took it and we said, this is available for whoever wants to use it inside their classrooms. And it had different types of activities and things associated with it. We did a virtual field trip. We helped to coordinate that. So literally online live one day, we had students from across the country log in. They could see people, kind of walking around, describing what was going on. They had a group online who could answer questions. So as the students were sitting there, if they had questions, they could type it in. And then we had experts online who could, or ANS did, who could answer those questions for them. Very interesting way of approaching education. They've set up ambassador programs. They've set up kind of train the trainer programs to try to help people learn how to teach about nuclear, because that's really important. So they have that piece of it. They have very active student chapters. They also have very active kinds of technical groups like Conti, who goes towards the technical trainers. There's other kinds of technical committee meetings. That's what these are considered. And so they have a part of that. And they also recently developed the new Nuclear 101 credential, which is if somebody's a mid-career professional, let's say they are a mechanical engineer, but they've never dealt in a nuclear environment before. There are certain specialty things you need to know about being in an environment. So if they come into the industry and the employer doesn't really have time to bring them up to speed, they can give them this 40 or 80 hour credit program. And then they can kind of learn what's unique about nuclear very quickly.
Nice.
So those are the types of things that ANS does.
Yeah, I noticed it seemed like there's a lot of universities here as well.
Yes.
But,
yes, they're very much into the
K-12
education, K-12.
Yeah.
Students, the students are primarily from those educational backgrounds.
Yeah.
So they're kind of that education piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I never got invited to the American Nuclear Society on my college campus. I wasn't smart enough. I know.
Well, you don't have to be smart enough to be in the American Nuclear Society. You just have to be interested to be in the American Nuclear Society.
I met a training director here at one of the nuclear plants, and she's talking. She's got a chemistry background. I was like, oh my gosh, I hated chemistry in high school. And she's like, yeah, you really have to have a good instructor. She had a great high school teacher for chemistry, and I did too, but I just didn't enjoy it. But
well, one of the things I have to point out is that we are trying to make it easier for people with non-STEM backgrounds to try to get into nuclear.
Sure.
So, for example, we created a new website called Nuclear Works in December of last year. Fantastic.
Yes.
And we're going to continue to build out the capabilities of that website. But one of the things that I want to point out is on that front page, we have these video testimonials and we have a carousel, and we have these carousels on all the pages. But one of the ones that we make sure to highlight is we have a young lady who does not have any STEM background whatsoever. It's a liberal arts background, a humanities background, something like that. And she explains that she was scared to come into nuclear because she assumed you had to have a STEM background, but how she's learned, what she's done, what her background is, and why she enjoys being in nuclear energy.
Yeah.
So we need to continue to do a good job of trying to bring people in that don't necessarily have what we consider to be the standard background. And try to see if we can work with them to get them to be.
Do you think that the premise of do people make decisions? Maybe this is just from my experience. I didn't think about in high school joining the nuclear industry or the petrochemical industry.
Exactly.
I didn't think about
Yes.
that way. I thought about what I wanted to maybe do.
Right.
My parents just kind of encouraged me to find what you love and make sure you're helping people. That was their advice, which I loved. Just help people. Don't do something stupid. But help us understand the premise of, why is that the best approach to try to say you should join the nuclear industry versus you should be an electrician? And by the way, there's jobs at nuclear plants, right? Why do you take that approach?
Well, here's the thing from a broader perspective. The Nuclear Works website is for people who are interested in looking at understanding what the nuclear energy industry has to offer, the different types of positions. Overall, though, one of the discussions that we had here was about the new 17th career cluster. Technically, it's the 14th career cluster, but regardless, we called it that for so many years. That's about energy and natural resources. And basically what that does is that allows us to work with educators to develop career pathways that we never had in K-12 before, and even post-secondary. And through that, because it's energy, it's not nuclear energy. It's just energy. People can find out about all the great things. If they want a job as a lineman, if they want a job in gas, or they want a job in nuclear or whatever, there's a lot of similarities in what people do. And in fact, if you know about the operations of a plant, the issue is that you're creating steam to get electricity. People are creating that steam in different ways. Coal does it in one way, gas does it another, solar does it another, wind does it another. But once you get to that turbine, it's all the same thing. Right? So there's only a piece of it that's very specialized. So one of the approaches that we're taking is, I was saying earlier about we're revising the nuclear uniform curriculum program. And one of the things that we're doing is we're creating a 6-month certificate program that allows for a very basic level of knowledge and skill that can get people jobs in any energy company. And then we're hoping from there, we can compete as nuclear energy to get those people and then grow them and stack their credentials into a more nuclear energy specific. But let's get people into the pipeline and then try to convince them, right? So there is some validity to what you're saying. Let's get people to these jobs in general. And then let's try to influence from there, or persuade from there, or provide additional information and education from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the selling points is if you live in Idaho Falls, Idaho, you know, one of the biggest employers in the state is right here, and it's a great facility, like in talking about the Idaho National Labs. And so if you're marketing talking about the talent awareness problem here, like if you market to that, 500-mile radius, it could be much more about that employer or the nuclear industry, which makes sense.
Right.
I guess I'm thinking at a national level, a kid in Santa Rosa, California, there might be nuke plants close by, but they've got no idea what they are and all that. So what's the best way to get them in the door? And,
well, that's part of the problem. Putting aside the fact that you're looking at what specific roles people can do. The fact is because we were so many years afraid of talking about nuclear energy because everybody was conflating nuclear energy with nuclear arms and other things. We kind of hid, right?
Yeah, sure.
And we had a very stable set of personnel. We weren't really experiencing attrition.
Yeah.
People were staying with us for very long periods of time. So we didn't have to struggle with getting people, right? Yeah. And the people with these good jobs were telling their family members and so forth, so on. So word of mouth was kind of getting us what we needed. And, and so we were content and we stayed very below the radar and we kind of hid ourselves and we were afraid to, yeah. And so now that's changed.
Yep.
Now, we got to be out there. We've got to be competing. So we got to make people aware that we exist.
Yep.
So putting aside, going into curricula for high school or whatever else, putting all that aside, just getting people to recognize that we're employers out there in the world, that's an issue. That's a problem because we hid for so long that we've got to undo all that years of hiding. And we got to get visible again, and we got to be proud to be visible again. Sure. And I think we're a very proud industry. It's just that we've always been very quietly proud.
Well, yeah, there's been a definite backlash we talked about earlier, right? It's just weird. So I'm excited to see more of that with the Nuclear Works website. And, so this is kind of a case study, or it might be an interesting A/B test for you all, that there's a nonprofit we're looking at partnering with in a deeper way called Skill Up. And it's a pretty standard career marketplace type experience. So a high schooler can make a profile. They have, they limit, I love how they limit it. They limit it to like 35 jobs pulled off of a certain database. And then the candidate can explore those 35 jobs. They're mostly STEM or technical.
Yeah.
And then they can do career exploration experiences, maybe, and then even sign up for community college programs or job specific training for those jobs.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's job postings as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic.
So yeah, obviously they have electrician on there. They have plumber, pipe fitter, operating engineer roles that the industry hires. So I would assume that nuclear power plants would benefit from posting their jobs there.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a much broader stroke type of national thing versus you just have to deploy different strategies, right, for a talent acquisition process.
Right.
So, that in that one, every employer is going to get lost. It's kind of odd. There's not much selling it's selling the career of electrician,
right? Right.
So someone's got to get excited about building things and electricity,
right? Right. And that's what Nuclear Works is as well.
Yeah.
It's not intended to really promote any one employer, although certainly we made sure that there were links to the employers so that if they wanted to immediately start exploring job opportunities, let's say there's somebody from high school, they come onto the website, they do the little quiz role finder that we have, and they go, look, there's 30 jobs I can do. Okay, well, where's one of these places near us? They can then go and find an employer in their area, see if they have one of those jobs available, apply for it, etc. So we wanted them to have that capability. But overall, this is just about getting people to be aware of the depth and breadth of jobs that we have across the industry. And we're still building out the database. We've got probably between 250 to 300 jobs in there right now, but we want to continue to grow.
and there's a standardized list of jobs that you're
Mhm.
trying to make across industry and,
That's exactly right.
yep,
That's exactly right. We're not trying to tailor to any specific employer.
sure. You know, I read a crazy stat in the past year. I'm going to share some research with you.
I love it.
You'd love it. It's across kind of the whole our customer base we have around the problem sets. We've built a skilled workforce maturity model,
Mhm.
you know, involving recruit, ramp,
Right.
results, retain.
Right.
And I was shocked to find out that very few employers post entry-level jobs
Mhm.
on job boards and stuff.
Mhm.
And frankly, a lot of employers aren't set up to handle.
Mhm.
So it was twofold. It was like, even though they might have entry-level positions sort of available, they're not posted, which just sounds odd.
Right.
And then in a lot of cases, employers aren't set up to have entry-level jobs.
Mhm.
This is probably more so smaller,
Mhm.
you know, industry, smaller employers. But do you find that nuclear industry has a lot of entry-level opportunities for someone like coming out of a 6-month program or a 2-year
Yeah.
program to some extent?
Yeah, I would say yes, there's opportunity. What I would say is that we need to do better about continuing to be able to provide those opportunities, more of them.
Yep.
We need to break down the qualifications even more so that they focus on this piece.
Yeah.
And from a regulatory perspective, they're good because they're focusing on just this thing. Then we can build their skill level for this thing and then build their skill
Yeah.
level for this thing.
Well, it matters to me, because it's the optimal time to capture someone is between, you know, 17 to 25, let's call it, whatever when they're looking, right? Well, if we lose them to another industry,
Mhm.
they might be looking half as
Yeah.
hard
Yeah.
when
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
25, 26.
Yeah.
So
So there's opportunities, but I think we need to do better at providing even more of those.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And obviously there's a big trend towards micro learning, but smaller qualifications, you know, that are
Yeah, micro credentials.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And I'm sure have you seen a lot of the noise around, that's a bad way of saying it. I'm getting tired. A lot of the initiatives around skills-based employers and skills-based hiring.
Yeah.
Skills-based organizations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Skills Forward is a cool site. They've got a credential engine
Mm.
and it's around, you should check it out. It's like,
Yeah,
it's sort of like a clearinghouse, but yeah, it's obvious that's where most people are thinking to go. But I think the challenge is it's going to add complexity, because when you're talking about micro credentials across 30 different industries, it's going to be, you might have 10 different variations of a certain of electrician. But what's great about the nuclear space is how collaborative you are.
Yes, because that's the last thing we want.
Totally.
For example, the NUCP program, the crux behind that was, let's create this uniform standardized curriculum. That way, if somebody gets an NUCP certificate here, we know that if they move across the country that they were appropriately qualified.
Can you give us an example of one of those?
Yeah. So under the
program.
Nuclear Uniform Curriculum Program, there's multiple types of curricula that was set up. So for example, there's non-licensed reactor operators. I'm sorry, non-licensed operators.
Yeah.
There's different maintenance people. There's INC technicians, instrumentation and control technicians.
Thank you.
Radiation protection technicians. There's different various categories of things. And so if somebody gets their associate's degree as a non-licensed operator through the NUCP program, if they are in, I don't know, let's say Massachusetts, and they move to California, and this person in California sees that they got their NUCP certificate, they know immediately what level of credential they have, because it's a very precise curriculum about what's being taught and how it's being taught.
And is that's managed by INPO?
So it's co-managed between NEI and INPO.
Okay, great. So you have something to do with that.
I do. I'm a program manager for NUCP. That's correct.
Nice.
Yeah.
What's the shortest credential? Just curious in that. Do you wear
Right. Well, as I said earlier, the Nuclear Uniform Curriculum was set up for 2-year community colleges.
Okay.
Having said that, we are in the process of updating the ACAD so we can add that 6-month certificate that I was talking about that gives that very basic level of skill and qualification about energy in general.
Sure.
Where people can utilize that in lots of different jobs.
Yeah.
But then it's our goal to try to pull those people in and then help them stack on top of that credential.
That's right.
To get other things.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to argue for really short trainings. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 5 to 10 year
Yeah.
ramp up period,
Yeah.
so like,
Yeah.
that is a big barrier. Obviously we found is just that a 2 year time commitment or
Right.
$20,000 of
Yeah.
community college tuition, right?
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
can we get people in the door
Yeah.
and with a plan? So,
Yeah.
and I have heard examples of that. Actually, again, at Idaho National Labs, they partner quite a bit with Idaho State University, who have the 2 year programs. I'm guessing those are NUCP programs.
I don't think they are.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's for the DOE primarily. So maybe they don't have to, they've got different rules with the DOE.
Yeah. And it's not that people have to take advantage of the nuclear uniform curriculum. You can still have a great program that is not aligned. But the idea behind that is that by developing that standardized curriculum, people know what they get and it's transferable, easily transferable.
Yeah.
Having said that, well, there was something you said a moment ago I was going to comment on.
INL and Idaho State University.
Yeah.
And the
It was right before that. I'll remember in a minute, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Apologies.
No,
it escapes me.
Well, yeah, the gentleman was saying that they often will go right into, I think they have a nuclear, maybe it's a licensed operator program at Idaho State University. And INL could go in there and hire someone in week 6 or week 12, right? And help support them through their 2 years, but now they're getting on the job. So that's, to me, that's an ideal situation, how a lot of apprenticeships are structured, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah, just curious, because it sort of runs in the like again, 2 year program sort of runs counter to the a skills based idea. But it sounds like you all are doing a really good job of identifying. You have to have some smallest common denominator, least common denominator. Like,
yeah, that's what we tried. That's what we're trying to do with that.
Yeah.
I remember now what I was going to say. There is something at the high school level and immediate post-secondary that people can take advantage of. It's more energy in general. And it's through the Center for Energy Workforce Development, and it's called the Energy Industry Fundamentals. And what that does is it gives a high level overview of the different energy sources, what they are, and things that people really need to know about them to give them some basic understanding of what's going on. It's kind of giving people a tutorial, and it helps them understand kind of the types of jobs and things that they can get in energy.
Nice.
Now, having said that, one of the things that we are able to do if we finance it is add on a nuclear specific module. So if somebody's going through the EIF and they go, you know what, that nuclear sounds pretty cool, let me learn more, then we're trying to get that finance right now to get that module so that people can go in and get a little bit more extensive of an understanding of what specifically is going on with nuclear. So CWD is talking with a couple of groups right now who might be willing to finance that.
Nice.
So we're looking forward to that. So fingers crossed.
Yeah. Is that, how long is that course or experience?
Yeah. So the energy industry fundamentals, I want to say, is maybe 120. 120 hours, maybe.
And someone can take it in high school as well as beyond potentially. And
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
We have similar programs at Interplay, actually. We call them job ready certificate programs. And they're, first of all, we have these career explorations. So like using electrician, there's a 2-hour career exploration experience. So
That's cool.
A video you start with hearing from an electrician and day in the life.
Yeah.
And then take some training. You show up in a simulation in the tool room and see the PPE you have to use and what a multimeter is.
That's awesome.
And all that.
Yeah.
And then the kind of I described the job ready certificates as like pre-apprenticeship experiences. So about 80 hours of content, similar to 120. And it's just, it's getting someone, we really explain to employers that it's going to get them a ability to be productive on day one to some extent, but they need to go into an apprenticeship program like on day one. Right. So they have their basic safety stuff. They've done some prep work maybe on their licensing needs. It's pretty neat, but I think we'd be, one thing we're looking at doing is seeing if there's opportunities to partner with different industries on making more industry specific ones. Right now, like there's some smaller, like HVAC industry or electrician industry,
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah. And using one thing that's really enabling there, which is killer, is not just simulation, because you can do it anywhere, but but we have Sam as our AI mentor.
Mhm.
So Sam is skills advisor and mentor.
Oh, neat.
So if you got into an electrician simulation, you could
Uh-huh.
just talk to Sam natural language natively,
Nice.
and he or she can walk you through whatever voice you want,
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
And then I know our product team wants to sort of expand that into career exploration,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
being a career advisor to some extent,
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Similar to what you were saying, I know that over time, with Nuclear Works, we'd like to build it out so that people can see and experience more of what these positions are and do.
yeah,
That's not going to be in the next year or two. We have other things that we need to focus on, including building out the video carousels and things like that.
yeah,
But over time, we'd like to be able to get, videos and things where people can get a better sense of what it's like to do this or what it's like to do that.
yeah,
We're going to start that, I think, by doing what we call career highlights. So the things that we are experiencing the most difficulty in terms of recruiting and attracting into the industry, we'll probably put on the front page as, this career highlight, and we'll have content about it, to try to highlight that and try to draw more people into
sure,
it. But over time, on the different target audience pages, it would be great to be able to get into and, show them, kind of bringing that augmented reality, virtual reality thing that we're doing
yeah,
much better as an industry, and bringing a sense of that online in a
yeah,
2D environment so
yeah,
they can kind of see it and see, oh yeah, okay, so that's what happens when you do this or when you do this, and show
yeah,
some of the cool things that we do in the industry.
yeah,
Not that everything that we don't do is cool, but
yeah,
perhaps
yeah,
some of the things that are a little cooler than other
totally.
coolers.
Well, and yeah, I don't know if I told you this. I'm gonna, go out to Europe this spring
Oh,
with my
nice.
family, and we're going
Okay.
to go to CERN, the
Nice.
Large Hadron Collider. And
Yes.
I, I
Yes.
used to not like chemistry, but as I've gotten older, I mean, I trying to get my kids excited about the energy innovation is really stinking cool. There's a lot of unknowns still
Hmm.
in energy. It's like
Right.
it's definitely a science and physics in general that
Yeah.
um, has a lot further to go. So it's exciting.
Yeah.
What I was curious, what sort of work or research have you all done around like what matters? This is probably more of a labor market question, but
Mhm.
what matters today to your maybe we could boil it down to maybe skilled trades. Like, what are their big selling points or value propositions to people you're hoping to get into skilled trades roles in the industry?
Yeah. One of the great things, and I know that this applies to other industries, but
Sure.
I mean, in our world, these jobs are very high paying jobs.
Yeah.
Um, Outside of kind of the outage work, which tends by its nature to be seasonal, they tend to be very reliable, stable jobs.
In one
Uh,
place.
they're in one place.
Yeah.
They're very,
It's tough to move a nuclear plant, right?
yeah, you're not moving a nuclear plant.
Yeah.
And so, you have that capability. We do have more seasonal work as well,
Yeah.
but they're very high paying jobs. They're very good jobs. They are very stable jobs. They're very community center based jobs,
Sure.
which I think has its own benefit. I would say sometimes the disadvantage of working with one of our plants is that, sometimes, might have to do shift work.
Yeah.
You might have to come in if something's going on with the plant, or you're in an outage or something like that, a planned outage,
Yeah.
etc. But
Yeah.
overall, the quality of jobs that we have in our industry, very high,
Sure.
very, very high. People like working with us for the most part. What I will say is, I'll kind of flip the script a little bit and say, I actually met with a bunch of representatives from the North American Young Generation in Nuclear, NAYGN, we call them. And we did this a couple years ago as a workshop because we wanted to find out, what is it going to take to retain you in the industry, and why might you consider leaving the industry? And that kind of gave me some insight into what they're thinking and what they're feeling and what they want. And some of the things that they are saying that they want is, number one, they want to work in places that they feel are modern and innovative.
Yeah.
I took that back to the chief nuclear officers. I'm like, y'all need to get your digital I&C going, and upgrade your facilities if you haven't upgraded them in a
Sure.
while. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
They also, with the ability to move for remote jobs and things these days, they understand that in nuclear, that you might have to go in, especially if you're an operator or something, you have to go in, and they're okay with that. But what they've said is, if you're going to ask me to go in every day, you have to offset that with the things that I can't do, the kind of the lifestyle things. So you need to bring dry cleaning on, can you bring that dry cleaning vendor who can come pick up my stuff and take it away? Or can you help me with childcare? Childcare was a huge one. At one point they said, oh, we should have, it would be great if you all had childcare on site. I'm like, we're not putting childcare in a nuclear facility. Like I don't think the NRC would particularly appreciate that. Having said that, we could see, about subsidies for childcare within a certain area of that, or whatever the case may be. So there's certain things like that they really care about. They care about career growth and opportunity. What broke my heart when I was talking to them, or when we were talking to them, is one of them said, it was 3 years after I started working at this place that I found out about the leadership development program they had available. They're not, so our plants aren't doing a good job of telling all the different programs that we have. We develop all these great programs, but for some reason they're not being communicated, so people aren't learning about them, and then they get frustrated and then they leave because they don't know that there's these things out there that are available to help them continue to grow. So I went back and I said to Chief Newcastle, I'm like, you got to ramp up your onboarding programs. Like, make sure these things are known. Why are you losing people over things that exist? Those are some of the things, the career growth, making sure their pay and benefits are commensurate with the fact that if they have to go in, that kind of help offsets it. That they really want to feel like they're part of something new and innovative. So I've said to the CNOs, I said, from a cultural perspective, you need to keep that in mind. Even if we're not a new facility, we can be innovative in our culture and in our approach to dealing with our employees. So keep that in mind. So in terms of taking your question, flipping a little bit, and I'm saying, this is what they're saying that they want from us.
What I was curious about. And a lot of it's, people care about their pay. They care about who their boss is, right? Typically they care about the culture and the peer group. But I think a major selling point when I think about the opportunities across the skilled trades is the no travel is a big deal. I mean, shift work is a little bit of an odd trade-off, but think about folks in construction or oil and gas and whatnot, and it's a tough life, sometimes. And it's a big, I think my father's generation was much more willing to, first of all, move a family across town or across the country for a job, but also he was traveling a lot for work, as part of the expectation. I don't know if I'm a millennial. I don't know if my generation has that same appetite. And I think it's, if I recall my Gen Z orientation a bit, it's Gen Zs typically like to be on device a lot, manage relationships on device, be at home even a bit more. You're not going out to bars and dating at whatnot. So
well, they grew up very much digitally. That's not
correct.
The way I grew up. The TRS-80s and all those came about when I was 10, 11, 12, whatever the case may be. So I grew up in a foot in both worlds, where I didn't have digital, and then very modicum of digital. And then by the time I was in college, we were starting to have personal computers that were more popularized and things like that. But the Gen Z, they've had a computer version in their hands since they were very tiny, whether it's a little tiny laptop thing or a little tiny phone thing, or whatever the case may be. They're very digitally oriented. So that means that they're very used to taking in data at an extremely high pace and rate. And so we have to remember that as we're trying to teach them. More than that, because that's the environment they're used to, that's how we have to remember that we have to think about how we're going to train them as well. They are used to that. That's what they're comfortable with. They don't like sitting in a classroom for all those hours that like I used to have to sit in when I was being trained on something. That was the only way you were getting trained. You had to sit in that room with a person with a chalkboard for X number of hours. And when you were done with all that misery, then you could get your credential, right? These days, they want it to be made easier. It needs to be on demand. Can you just go home on your computer and do the training when you have the time, energy, and effort? Can it be in small bits in terms of micro learnings? All of those kinds of things. Those are all the things that we need to consider as an industry as we're looking at our training infrastructure and how we're going about doing all of this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, obviously this is a training conference, but the appetite for technology and technology option in the training motion seems really good and high.
Yeah.
To wrap up, I'd be curious your thoughts on the skilled trades, like what, I'm a little confused on, I'm aware that like the typical power plant will have about a third of their workforce. You know, if a plant has 1,000 people, a third of the workforce might be in operations and maintenance type of roles. And hear me out on this. So that those are full-time positions typically, right? Facilities maintenance, plant maintenance, et cetera. When there's a big outage, we might have another, we might double the headcount, right?
Yeah.
To refuel and do all the things every 18 months.
Yeah.
What does a typical utility hire, if they're a union employer, do they hire, if they're hiring electricians and operating engineers, do they typically hire journeymen for these full-time positions? Like, can you help us understand kind of the labor relations side of how that works? And then for non-union environments, I'm assuming it's a little bit different, but yeah, just curious how plants like that get and manage their full-time staff that are at O&M.
Yeah. So,
because the purpose too is to reflect on.
Yeah.
That's another thing you get to navigate is like when you're advertising to skilled tradespeople, sometimes a better route is you should go join the operating engineers local.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah. And that's because in many cases we have closed shops for certain types of roles and positions. So the only way that you can get a job at the facilities if you're willing to join that particular union.
Yep.
Now, having said that, unions can be one of two things. They can represent the interest, in all cases, they represent the interests of their members. But in many cases, since you're talking about electricians, if you look at IBEW as an example, they are also, because they know that people in those plants are going to be their members, they also are great training partners.
Totally.
Because they know what's needed. They deal with it enough, and they are active in trying to get people because it helps them, because it helps their membership, right? And then that helps us because it helps us get another employee in, right? So it's a symbiotic relationship, right? It's very different when you're dealing with an organization where they don't have those union shops, in which case it's completely up to the employer to make sure that they're meeting the appropriate guidelines in terms of what's needed for the skills and proficiencies of the job to make sure that the job is appropriately done. So, if that means that they need 5 years of experience doing X, or this many years doing this, or they've reached this level of skill and qualification, that's more on the employer to make sure that they're meeting the appropriate skill and proficiency of the job based on, what is needed. And different people can set up their jobs in different ways. So it's not necessarily always the same structure of how people are managing their staffs. So yeah, I mean, the unions have actually been a really great partner in nuclear. So, and actually, we deal with them quite a bit, and they're very interested as we look forward to the future in how they can help increase the number of people coming into the industry as well, because they're vested in that. So they're asking, hey, what programs do you need us to set up to help you? They're actually asking,
can they perform? I guess they could get signed up to perform STEs if possibly, and then other requirements. Otherwise, currently the employer would do that inside the gate or at the training center, right?
Yeah, there's always kind of a requirement to make sure that people have a certain level of proficiency. They go through the union program, that's great, but when they come on, they're going to be appropriately monitored to make sure that the level of skill actually performing on site is what it needs to be. There'll always be the analysis as well as their background, and making sure that if they need a certain number of years of experience, that they have that, and they apply certain under ANSI 3.1 and so forth, so on, how they apply experience and all of that. But at a nuclear plant, we're very, very careful about making sure that we monitor how people are performing
Yeah,
for obvious reasons.
totally.
So, and making sure they're proficient.
Yeah. And are there roles like, well, we talked about RP earlier,
Mhm.
radiation protection. That doesn't sound like a trade union I've ever heard of, right? So like
No,
it's
typically not.
that's a non-union role,
Typically,
even
yeah.
inside a union or a plant that has union
Right.
agreements with
Correct.
BEW, et cetera, right? So that can happen with maintenance roles or other roles.
Mhm.
And have you found, it's interesting. I know of one facility that had iron workers working on they were running
Mhm.
overhead cranes and
Mhm.
doing refueling activity.
Mhm.
And then another totally different organization, similar activity, had a different trade doing
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah.
that's up to
Mhm.
the labor relations folks at the company with those unions that they have available to them, right? As
Yeah.
to who does what work.
Right. Well, it's also about it's a little technical, but it's also about what union does the appropriate activity to get the people to buy into their union.
Yeah.
So it's not like, the employees go, we want a union, and you all
Yeah.
pick which union.
Yeah. Yeah.
They come in and they get them to be a part of their union.
Yeah.
So you can have two different unions kind of performing relatively similar jobs. But that's how they organized to get
Yeah.
those particular members.
Yeah. Good point. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny. Rigging is an activity that happens in several different trades, right? So it's I can see how iron workers or boiler makers or pipe fitters might be doing that activity depending on the environment. But yeah, there's obviously, besides that, it seems like with NAB too, there's very clear lanes on obviously what unions do. And yeah, it's good to hear. We deal with a lot of unions. We supply a lot of simulation content to unions for their apprenticeship program. A lot of them do have a challenge around, they don't know what and how to upskill people past their journeyman status. We've heard that quite a bit. Like, it's hard to scale, and they don't, because they've got members in all sorts of different industries.
Right.
So
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Some have gone the route of sort of aggregating e-learning content that a member could self-select what they want. But
yeah. Well, I know that I've had very specific conversations with some leadership from at least a couple of union groups, and they are all in. They're asking, what can we do? What can we develop? What do you all need? How can we help?
Yeah. And you're in DC, right? Okay. Yeah. Obviously most of the internationals are headquartered there, I think, right?
I would say so.
Yeah.
I'd say so. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of the national ones as well, not just international.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, we should wrap up talking about I think the breakdancing that happened at the Olympics.
The breakdancing race. Right.
Did you hear about that?
I did, and I saw it. It took me a while to find the actual video because apparently, everybody started scrubbing it from the internet for whatever reason. But I did find a copy of it, and I watched it, and I watched in amazement.
There was some controversy about it too. I'm not sure what's true or what's not, so I won't spread anything. But like, the Australian breakdancing community was not happy about it in general, and then it was just
I could see why they were less than thrilled with the representation that they had.
The Olympics should have they have ice skating, ice dancing. They don't have any regular dancing, do they? The Olympics?
No, it's been petitioned a few times and they've turned it down a few times.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're adding some odd things though.
They are.
I've noticed some like that shouldn't be.
Yeah, things come and go. So the next Olympics, there's not going to be breakdancing. It's already determined.
Oh, darn it.
I think that was determined even before this last one, or at least that's what I heard.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on the Olympics for sure, but that's what I heard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll quit my breakdancing.
You're not going to gear up for the Olympics, huh?
No. I'd like to see one someday, but it is. I don't think it's fair, especially when there's a sport that hardly anyone plays. Like if it's going to be in the Olympics, it should be played in a lot of countries.
Yeah.
But It is.
Well, what I will say is though, the counter argument to that, not that I'm a contrarian,
Sure.
although I'm a little bit of a contrarian,
Yeah.
is remember before the oh gosh, it's getting late. So the dream team. Sorry, I was having
Yeah.
trouble. Before that, international basketball wasn't that big of a deal.
True. Yeah.
Once everybody saw the dream team and saw what was happening with that, international basketball exploded. And a lot of those people now are here in the US, and they're some of our best NBA players at this point.
That's a good point. I just rewatched the Michael Jordan Bulls special thing on Netflix, The Last Dance. A really good series if you haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it.
It hits on that. It was really, David Stern was the commissioner at the time, and I mean, international popularity just skyrocketed after 92.
Yes, I remember. So I remember I was around, and I remember actually watching the Dream Team.
Yeah.
And at the time, the funny thing is just personally, I hated Larry Bird because he was always beating my team, and you could always just watch him and you just knew he was going to beat you.
Yeah.
And now these days I just adore him, right? Like now looking,
who was your team?
Well, of course I'm from DC.
Yeah. Okay.
So back in the day it was the Bullets, but of course now it's the Wizards.
Yeah.
And so he was always beating my Bullets, right? At the time. And I was just like, I can't play blah, 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 blah. But once I got kind of beyond that and I look back at it, I just love the guy. I mean, with his spirit and attitude and whatever, but he and Magic Johnson changed the trajectory of basketball forever. Really yes, Michael Jordan, you can make the argument that he's the GOAT, but if it hadn't been for Larry and Magic, there wouldn't have been as strong of an NBA to really float and make that the popular thing that it was. They rose the level in an area that really skyrocketed basketball to another place that it hadn't been before. So, kudos to those guys.
You should watch the Last Dance series.
Okay.
You'll like it because it definitely starts in the 80s with MJ at UNC, and then talks about the history of the Lakers and Celtics, and the Pistons had a moment, for a few years.
Yes, they did. The bad boys.
Yeah. I was a huge Bulls fan growing up. I mean, I lived in Washington State, but I definitely was an MJ fan. And and it's funny how he describes Larry. He basically says in the things like, Larry was a problem. Like he was
really he used
good.
To frustrate all the fans because you knew if you were playing Larry Bird that there was that he was probably going to take over if needed to be and win. You couldn't control that guy. He just was that good. So
Kobe and was like that, seems like, and Michael took over games, but the
NBA's
NBA's got
problems.
the NBA's got to find their way. Their popularity's been down the past few years. I don't know what's going on.
I really haven't watched the last few years, but I've just been busy with other things.
I wonder I don't know if they're missing the narrative that existed with the battles, right? I mean, you had the hegemon and the challenger all the time, right? And if you don't have that narrative, it's tough.
Part of it is, and this is just my opinion, I could be wrong, but it's one of the reasons why I'm not as enthused about it anymore is, back in the day, in my opinion, everybody played hard night to night to night to night. And the stars were stars, but they didn't come across as, these highly paid diva kind of people. They get a little bit of an injury and whatever. Back in the day, if you had an injury, you just suffered through it and you went on with life, right? But that's a Gen X thing to begin with and a baby boomer thing to begin with. That's just a quality of how we tend to be. But having said that, I think you get a little bit more of a prima donna feeling from basketball players these days, and that they're not as willing to that they're not as willing to kind of go in there and fight the battle, inside, because that used to be what basketball was. You had to fight inside, you had to go in, and now everybody's just kind of jumping up and doing a bunch of threes and and it's running up and back and forth to the court, and how many threes can you get in, and jumpers and things like that. And to me, that's not as interesting.
Totally.
To me, it was interesting when it was more physical, and when people were willing to be more physical, not to the point where they were getting injured. I don't think that's ever interesting to watch anybody get injured.
Of course.
But I just think
you see the intensities pick up in the playoffs. So they're definitely playing differently, and it's not nearly as intense as it was. I totally agree. You make good conclusions, Lori. You draw some good conclusions.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I really appreciate you joining.
Of course, my pleasure.
We've emptied your conference here. So
well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
the world in play, keeping systems in the fray. Every spark and every beam, built by those who dare to dream.